They had left for war with songs on their lips and dreams of glory in their hearts. But by the spring of 1943, the illusion of invincibility had turned to sand beneath their boots. In North Africa, under a relentless sun and endless Allied bombardments, the Afrika Korps collapsed. Thousands of German soldiers, drained and dust-covered, surrendered in waves. Among them were young conscripts barely out of school and war-hardened veterans who had fought on the Eastern Front. The surrender brought no relief, only a new kind of fear. American leaflets had promised humane treatment, but German propaganda had painted a darker picture. For years, Nazi officers and radio broadcasts warned that Americans were ruthless, driven by greed, and incapable of mercy. Prisoners of war, they claimed, would be beaten, starved, and used like animals until they died or went insane. That narrative lived in the minds of every captured soldier, now herded into makeshift holding camps near the African coast. The holding camps were crowded, temporary, and tense. Rations were sparse, water was warm, and disease lingered in the corners. But worse than the conditions was the waiting. Rumors flew between tents and barbed wire. They would be sent to the Arctic, to Alaska, to be frozen. They would be paraded through American cities like circus beasts. They would never see home again. The air itself seemed to pulse with the uncertainty of what would happen next. Soon, the orders came. Men were divided into groups and loaded onto trucks. There was no explanation, no farewell, only the distant roar of engines and the squeal of tires over gravel. At ports along the coast, the soldiers saw them. Massive Liberty ships, hastily built but immense, towering above the docks like floating fortresses. These vessels were meant for tanks and supplies, not people. Now they would serve as vessels for the defeated. The boarding was fast and impersonal. The Germans were stripped of their few belongings, searched, and packed into the dark, narrow holds of the ships. Hundreds crammed together in the belly of steel giants. The air was thick with sweat, rust, and apprehension. The silence was often broken by dry coughs, whispered prayers, or the groan of the ship adjusting to the waves. Some scratched days into scraps of wood or cardboard, counting each hour as a victory. Every sound became a threat. The engine's constant hum, the sloshing of waves against metal, the creak of the hull. Each could signal a torpedo, a fire, a sinking. Some prisoners feared American cruelty. Others feared German submarines. The thought of being sunk by one's own navy, without warning or regard, was too painful to voice, but many carried it like a stone in their chest. Still, not every moment was bleak. The guards posted above did not shout or beat the prisoners. Meals were basic, but enough to satisfy hunger. Occasionally, cigarettes were tossed down, and a few American voices broke the silence with short, matter-of-fact phrases. For the prisoners, even small decency felt suspicious. Kindness had not been part of the story they were told. Among the prisoners was Hans, a foot soldier from Bavaria. He wrote later in a letter, "We thought we were sailing to hell." That phrase echoed in the minds of many. The Atlantic seemed endless, and America a myth. Yet the ships kept moving west, and the gray line between fear and curiosity began to blur. Every mile brought them closer, not just to a place, but to a reckoning with what they believed. By the time the coast disappeared behind them, most had stopped speaking. The silence of the hold was no longer the silence of terror, but of surrender to the unknown. And ahead of them, across the water, was a country they had been taught to hate, one that, within days, would begin to shatter every expectation they carried. When the first cry of land echoed through the hold, every prisoner snapped to attention. The men surged toward the narrow openings, jostling for space, eager for a glimpse of the continent they had both feared and fantasized about. After days in darkness, the sudden burst of daylight was blinding. Eyes squinted, mouths hung open, and for a long moment no one spoke. What unfolded beyond the rusted steel edges of the ship was not what they expected. Instead of the ruin they imagined, they saw towering cranes gliding over busy docks, long lines of trucks moving in choreographed precision, and ships being unloaded with astonishing speed. There were no prison camps in sight, no jeering mobs with fists raised. Only industry, motion, and a strange kind of order. The harbor wasn't filled with chaos, but with quiet efficiency. It looked less like a battlefield and more like a well-oiled machine. The skyline in the distance shimmered with glass and steel. Skyscrapers stood untouched, and smoke rose steadily from factory chimneys, not the black plumes of destruction, but the gray breath of production. It was overwhelming. To men who had seen European cities leveled to rubble, this place looked immune to war. Hans, standing shoulder to shoulder with Karl, whispered, "It's like they don't even know there's a war." As the prisoners descended the gangways, the smells of the port hit them in waves. Diesel fuel, salt, hot metal, and something they hadn't scented in weeks, roasting meat. They were handed trays, not chains. Soup, bread, and steaming coffee were offered without mockery or punishment. Many accepted the food without speaking, too stunned to react. A few stared at it in disbelief, half expecting it to be a trick. There were no chants, no parades of shame. The guards barked orders, but not in anger. They moved the prisoners efficiently, like men managing logistics, not vengeance. Some guards made eye contact without scorn. Others nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a shared burden neither side had asked for. The Germans had expected to be treated like trophies or criminals. Instead, they were treated like people. As they boarded the trains waiting beyond the docks, the shock deepened. The boxcars weren't cattle trucks. Benches lined the walls. Open windows allowed fresh air to circulate. The guards, rifles slung over their shoulders, didn't shout or threaten. They gave curt instructions and moved on. The prisoners, confused and exhausted, settled into the motion of the train, still trying to make sense of the day. Through the train windows, the first glimpses of inland America appeared like scenes from a dream. Neat little houses with white fences, front porches with rocking chairs, wide streets lined with trees, and children playing beside bicycles. It was too clean, too calm. No rubble, no ration lines, no ruins. Just ordinary life, untouched by the firestorms of Europe. In one town, schoolchildren ran to the edge of the tracks and waved. Some smiled. A few prisoners raised their hands in return, unsure if it was allowed. The guards didn't stop them. That moment, small and fleeting, burned into their memory. It wasn't hostility. It was curiosity, humanity even. As the train rolled on, Karl leaned closer to the window, watching families gather around picnic tables, waving from parked cars. He muttered, "They're not afraid of us." That realization was more disarming than any weapon. To be invisible to the people they thought they were fighting, no longer monsters, just passengers on a train, was its own kind of jolt. What stunned them most wasn't just the peace, but the abundance. Grain silos stood full. Grocery stores, glimpsed through windows, were stocked with fruit and canned goods. Billboards advertised soda, soap, and cigarettes as if luxury were a given. The contrast with bombed-out Europe was impossible to ignore. This was not the America they had been promised. This was something else entirely, something that didn't fit into their understanding of the world. The prison camp looked nothing like what the German soldiers had feared. There were no pits, no cages, no barbed nightmares. Instead, the compound resembled a small, self-contained village. Long rows of wooden barracks stretched across gravel paths, flanked by guard towers and floodlights. Everything had structure.
Too much structure, perhaps, but it wasn't chaos, and it wasn't cruelty.
Upon arrival, the prisoners braced for humiliation. They expected to be stripped, beaten, or shoved. Instead, they were calmly processed, handed bedding, shown their barracks, and given clear rules. The guards were firm but not violent. They communicated in clipped English, using gestures when words failed. There was no warmth, but there was no hatred either. Each day began with roll call. The men stood in neat lines as guards counted heads, their boots crunching in the gravel. Afterward, meals were served in a mess hall that resembled a modest cafeteria. The food was plain: meatloaf, potatoes, bread, coffee, but hot and surprisingly filling. To men who had survived on moldy bread and watery soup in North Africa, it felt like a feast. Work details were assigned quickly. Some prisoners cleaned the campgrounds, chopped wood, or cooked in the kitchen. Others maintained fences or repaired tools. For those who weren't working, classes were offered: basic English lessons, woodworking, even art. The Americans knew boredom was dangerous, so they filled the hours with routine. The routine slowly began to feel like stability. Sports became an unexpected outlet. Soccer teams formed by nationality, region, or even barrack. Matches drew loud crowds of cheering prisoners, their voices echoing across the compound. Guards watched from the sidelines, occasionally smiling. Baseball, the strange American game, also appeared. A few Germans attempted to play, swinging awkwardly while laughing at their own confusion. Evenings brought rare moments of leisure. Some nights, American newsreels and films were projected onto a wall in the recreation hall. Comedies, dramas, westerns, all unfamiliar but captivating. Music floated from some barracks: harmonicas, makeshift drums, even a battered violin. Those sounds became a comfort, a reminder that something human still lingered inside the wire. Letters from home arrived sporadically, brought in by the Red Cross. Though often delayed by months, they were cherished like treasure. Soldiers gathered around anyone who received a letter, listening as he read aloud. In return, they wrote back, careful with their words. How could they explain that, in enemy hands, they were safe, fed, and treated with dignity? But the camp was not a paradise. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. Some prisoners remained fiercely loyal to the Nazi ideology, enforcing silence or punishment on those they deemed disloyal. Secret meetings were held, threats whispered in the dark. Fistfights broke out. The Americans monitored it all, sometimes intervening, sometimes letting internal divisions burn themselves out. Still, the greatest surprise wasn't just the absence of brutality. It was how ordinary captivity began to feel. There was shame in that realization, but also relief. They had prepared themselves for hell. What they found instead was order, bread, and the slow, confusing return of hope. It unsettled them more than any guard ever could. The first time the prisoners were marched out of the camp gates, many braced for humiliation. They believed they would be chained, screamed at, or used for degrading labor. Instead, they were handed tools, shovels, rakes, and sacks, and escorted, not forced, into nearby fields. The guards remained armed, but relaxed. It wasn't punishment, it was work. America was running low on labor. With millions of men overseas, farms and factories needed help. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs could perform non-military jobs. So, the prisoners were assigned to assist American farmers with harvesting, planting, and clearing. It felt strange at first, helping the enemy feed its people. But necessity softened the edges of ideology. Labor became a language everyone understood. The farmers, many of them older or accompanied by their families, eyed the Germans with suspicion, but few were openly hostile. Work came before politics. A man with a crop to save didn't have time for grudges. Some gave instructions in gestures and short words. Others pointed silently, letting action speak. In those early days, the relationship was one of mutual utility, not kindness, but that was enough.
Hans remembered his first day in a cotton field in Alabama. The sun was brutal, the rows endless, and the farmer barely said a word. But at noon, he brought a jug of water and placed it in the shade without comment. No scolding, no commands, just water. It was an unspoken acknowledgement of shared humanity, delivered without ceremony. For Hans, it was more jarring than hostility.
The work was hard, but the rhythm was familiar. Dig, lift, carry, rest. There was something grounding in it. Unlike war, there were no surprises. Unlike the camp, there were no walls. The vast open fields gave the prisoners a taste of freedom, even if it was temporary. Some began to look forward to the days outside the fence. They received small wages for their labor, most of which went to the U.S. government to cover their upkeep. But a small portion was theirs to spend in camp canteens. Candy, stationery, cigarettes, trivial things, but they gave a sense of control. Some even used their earnings to send small gifts home, though few families could believe the stories they read. Enemy or not, their sons were being paid. Occasionally, the prisoners were taken into town on supervised errands. The experience was disorienting. Shelves overflowed with goods. Fruit, butter, coffee, and bread lined every aisle. To men who came from cities of rubble and starvation, it was like walking into another dimension. Carl whispered once, "This is why they win the war. They can feed everyone." But not every encounter was soft. Some Americans refused to speak to the prisoners, especially those who had lost family in the war. Cold stares and muttered insults still found their way into the fields. Yet even then, the hostility was restrained. The guards ensured order, and the farmers, in the end, needed the help. Over time, necessity dulled resentment. By the end of the first month, the soldiers no longer walked out of the camp with fear in their chests. They walked out with calloused hands and quiet acceptance. The land they had expected to hate was beginning to shape them, not through speeches or ideology, but through work, food, and the astonishing lack of cruelty. It was harder to cling to old hatred when your enemy handed you a shovel and said, "Pick clean." By the time the prisoners grew accustomed to life outside the camp, they had begun to see America not just as a place of order and abundance, but also as a land of contradictions. The first signs came in the form of wooden boards nailed above shop doors or painted across restroom entrances, "Whites only." At first, many Germans didn't understand what the signs meant, but soon the reality set in. In America, not all citizens were treated equally. One day, while working near a military installation, the prisoners were allowed into a mess hall for lunch. Across the room, Black American soldiers were seated separately, served different food, and spoken to differently. This disturbed many of the Germans. They, the enemy, were being fed generously and treated with basic respect, while American soldiers in the same uniform faced open segregation. Hans leaned toward Carl and whispered, "We're the prisoners, yet they are treated like ghosts." It sparked quiet debates in the barracks and in the fields. For some, it was evidence that American ideals were hollow, that this so-called land of freedom was built on hypocrisy. Others, however, saw it differently. They argued that a country could be both strong and flawed, both fair and unjust. That complexity didn't negate the kindness they had received. If anything, it made it feel more deliberate. The contradictions weren't limited to dining halls. On work trips into town, prisoners noticed separate schools, separate churches, even separate waiting rooms at bus stations. Sometimes they asked the guards about it. The answers were vague. "That's just how it is," one replied. Another simply changed the subject. The silence said more than any explanation could. Für denen reißt auf Nazi-Propaganda die Ironie war diffizil zu ignorieren.
Sie hatten getort, dass Amerika war eine Platz von Disordnung, wo Minderheiten über Weiße ruhlten, wo Moral hergebrochen war. But hier war ein Country, das trotz seiner Stärke die eigenen Menschen durch Skin Color dividierte. Der enemy turned out to be more prosperous, more organized, but also fractured in ways that echoed their own homeland's darkness.
One moment stayed with Hans for the rest of his life. A black American soldier offered him a cigarette through a fence. No words were exchanged, just a faint nod. The gesture was simple but powerful. That soldier had every reason to hate a German uniform, and yet he didn't. It was a reminder that dignity sometimes existed outside of systems, outside of rules. In the camp, conversations grew more philosophical. Could a nation treat prisoners well and still fail its own people? Could justice be partial and still meaningful? There were no easy answers. The guards, too, seemed aware of the contradictions. Some avoided eye contact when asked about segregation. Others offered quiet shrugs, as if to say, "We don't like it either." For some prisoners, these contradictions opened their eyes further. The propaganda they had believed began to unravel completely. If America could be imperfect yet kind, could Germany have been the opposite, orderly yet cruel? Others clung more tightly to their old beliefs, insisting that every country was corrupt in its own way, that decency was just a mask. But regardless of where each man stood, the cracks in the image were undeniable. The abundance of America had amazed them. The fairness of their treatment had softened them. But the inequality they witnessed forced them to wrestle with uncomfortable truths. And for the first time, many began to question not just the enemy, but the world they came from. As the war neared its end, the mood in the camps shifted. Rumors of German cities falling, of Hitler's death, and of unconditional surrender trickled in through Red Cross bulletins, guard whispers, and occasional newspaper clippings. Some prisoners refused to believe it, clinging to the idea that Germany would rise again. Others grew quiet, staring at the dirt beneath their boots, knowing deep down that their country no longer existed as they remembered it. The camp no longer felt like a holding space. It felt like a waiting room between two lives. When repatriation began, it moved slowly. Some prisoners were sent back within weeks, while others waited for months. Ships had to be prepared, ports reopened, logistics sorted. Each departure brought mixed feelings: relief, anxiety, guilt. They were going home, but home no longer meant what it used to. Cities were rubble, families scattered, and the country they were returning to had been altered forever. Before leaving, many prisoners collected the few things they had: sketches, carved wooden figurines, letters, and small tokens from American guards or farmers. These items, fragile as they were, held enormous emotional weight. They were proof that something unexpected had happened in captivity, something deeply human. Hans carried a small box he had carved himself, lined with a scrap of cloth from his barrack bunk. The voyage back across the Atlantic was calm, uneventful. No torpedoes, no fear. The sea was quiet, as if aware of the shift in history. Men stood at the rails and looked back at the horizon, no longer prisoners, but not quite free. Many didn't talk much on the journey. Some replayed memories in silence: fields of cotton, warm stew in a mess hall, laughter during a soccer match. Others just watched the waves. Back in Germany, the reception was jarring. Families were overjoyed but shocked. Their sons looked healthy, fed, and rested, strangely untouched by the devastation around them. How could they explain that they had lived better as prisoners than their families had as civilians? That they had eaten meat every day while their mothers survived on scraps? Some chose not to speak of it at all. Others tried, but words failed. Karl's mother cried when he told her about the warm bread and lemonade. "It sounds like a dream," she said. And perhaps it was. A dream that stood in stark contrast to the cold, hungry present they now faced. The guilt some prisoners felt was heavy, even as they had done nothing wrong. They had simply survived, and had been treated, in many ways, with more dignity than expected. Some former prisoners eventually returned to America, not as captives, but as immigrants. They married, started families, and built lives in the very country they had once viewed as an enemy. Their children grew up speaking English, never knowing the full details of their father's years behind barbed wire. Others stayed in Germany, but the memory of America remained like a hidden photograph in the back of their minds, clear, personal, and complicated. Over the decades, small artifacts resurfaced in American homes and German attics: a drawing signed in pencil, a wooden spoon marked with initials, a letter yellowed with time. These relics told stories no history book could fully capture, stories of how mercy defied propaganda, and how small moments, shared cigarettes, a jug of water, a smile, outlived the war itself. For many of the former prisoners, the first sight of America never left them. The docks, the cranes, the food, the silence of the guards, it all remained etched in memory. They had expected fists and chains. Instead, they found order, abundance, and restraint. It wasn't perfection, but it was not hatred. In the end, what they carried home was not just their bodies, but the contradiction of what they saw. A country that treated enemies better than they treated some of their own. A place full of injustice, yet capable of kindness. That realization stayed with them, not as a wound, but as a question, one they would ask themselves quietly for the rest of their lives.